So Marvel's released a new animated Spider-Man show that asks the question, what if Norman Osborn figured out Peter's secret and became Spider-Man's mentor instead of Iron Man? And as a Spider-Man fan, I'm here to give you my thoughts on what the show does well and what it doesn't, as well as talk about some of the more controversial topics such as the Osborn race swap. So let's get into it. Now, the first thing I need to talk about is the animation, because overall, it wasn't great. I'm not saying it were terrible, in fact I get what they were going for, blending old school comic style with modern animation effects. However, to me, the thick black outlines just felt jarring. And if I'm being honest, I also wasn't a fan of the human face designs, and some of the characters' basic movement frames looked pretty bad too, especially when compared to animated shows like What If. That being said, the fight scenes were pretty on point, giving us fluid animated action that captured Spider-Man's movements really well. Talking about Spider-Man, I have to say that this Spider-Man is definitely the weakest Spider-Man yet, at least throughout this first season. Like, I get the point that's made where he's been holding back because he's scared of his power, but it's not just that, it's his almost non-existent spider sense. Like when Spider-Man's fighting Daredevil. Great cameo by the way, but in the fight when Daredevil throws his baton and it ricochets off multiple surfaces before hitting Spider-Man back at head, Spider-Man's spider sense should have gone off, allowing him to dodge that attack. It's honestly like half of his fights the writers just forgot about his spider sense completely. Now Hudson Thames does a great job at the voice acting for Spider-Man. Until I looked it up I actually thought it was Tom Holland doing the voice work. And the series does a great job of capturing the essence of Peter Parker's struggle, juggling school, friendships, and the responsibility of being Spider-Man. It manages to stay true to the core themes of the character, showing how Peter's personal life is constantly at odds with his superhero life. However, one major issue undermines the entire narrative, which is Spider-Man's origin. In this version, Peter gets his powers after being bitten by a radioactive spider, which is true to Spider-Man's origins. But later in the series, Norman Osborn extracts Spider-Man's blood and injects it into a spider to create more Spider-Man. That injected spider is then accidentally sent back through time, where it bites Peter, turning him into Spider-Man, which is a complete paradox. The writers have essentially created a time loop with no clear starting point. To me, it's an unnecessary and convoluted twist on what's always been a simple iconic moment in comic book history. And it makes Spider-Man's entire existence feel less like fate or some scientific accident and more like a pointless contradiction. Okay, so it's time to go into one of the more controversial topics of the review. As you know, Marvel decided to race swap the Osborns in the series, and honestly, I'm not even mad about it. Norman and Harry being white was never a defining part of their characters, so it doesn't feel forced or out of place. Now, I'm not always a fan of race or gender swaps, but for me, it depends on two key things. Is the race or gender central to the character, and does the change still keep the essence of the original character? Take Nick Fury for example. In the comics and the 90s cartoons, he was a white guy. Then Samuel Jackson stepped into the role, completely owned it, and is now the face of Nick Fury in both films and comics. He kept the essence of the character, tough, strategic, always 10 steps ahead, whilst making the role his own. Now it's hard to imagine anyone else playing the character. But then there's Taskmaster in Black Widow. They gender swapped the character, which could have worked, but they stripped away everything that made Taskmaster unique. Instead of the superpower to perfectly copy any fighting style, they replaced it with technology. Then they removed the character's voice entirely, giving her the X-Men Origins Wolverine Deadpool treatment.
Wait, is that you? Your striker finally figured out how to shut you up.
The gender change wasn't the real issue. The problem was they changed everything else. The powers, the costume, the personality, to the point where it's not even Taskmaster anymore. They just slapped that name onto a completely different character. Now back to Norman Osborn. Yeah, he's been race swapped, but he still feels like Norman. He's intelligent, cunning and manipulative, only showing the side of him he wants people to see. He's still the ruthless businessman with a hidden dark side lurking underneath the polite persona. And that's what really matters. And honestly, after seeing this version of Norman, I can't help but imagine Giancarlo Esposito playing him in live action. He'd be perfect for the role. His calm, calculating demeanour and his ability to flip from charming to terrifying in a second fits the role of Norman Osborn like a glove. But Captain America Brave New World had to go and waste him on the character Sidewinder. What a missed opportunity. The most intriguing part of this show though is how Norman and Harry know that Peter's Spider-Man. And what's even more interesting is how Norman stepped into the role that Tony Stark holds in the main MCU timeline, acting as Peter's mentor. But we all know how this is going to end. At some point, Norman's going to betray Peter and become the Goblin, and since he already knows everything about Peter, his identity and his weaknesses, and the fact that Norman has wealth and influence on his side, things aren't going to go well for Spider-Man in the future. One of the biggest questions going forward though is how Harry will react when his father inevitably becomes the Green Goblin. Will he side with Peter, or will he follow in Norman's footsteps and become the Hobgoblin? Now, I thought how Harry and Peter's friendship developed throughout the series was done really well. Harry sees Peter as a real friend, not someone trying to use him for money or status. It's a realistic dynamic for Peter and Harry, and it makes the bond feel more real. But with Norman manipulating everything behind the scenes, it's hard to say where Harry will end up. Then there's Nico, another one of Peter's friends and a character from The Runaways. She's alright overall, but what really annoyed me was how mad she got at Peter for not telling her that he's Spider-Man, after finding out through Harry. Yet, she's keeping her own powers a secret from Peter. That double standard is a little hypocritical in my opinion. Now, let's talk about some of the villains because the show does a great job with all of them. Lonnie Lincoln's story is one of the most tragic in the series. His story runs almost parallel to Peter's. He's a smart kid that gets good grades, but is also the school's star athlete. But unlike Peter, he gets wrapped up and involved with the wrong crowd, being led down the wrong path. This shit happens to people every day, and all it takes is a few wrong choices, and I think the show handles it really well, making you feel sorry for Lonnie, rather than just seeing him as another villain. As for Scorpion, what a beast. He messes people up throughout this series. He's probably one of my favourite versions of Scorpion yet, with just how feral and crazy he is. The raw aggression he brings to the fights makes him feel like a real threat, not just the second-rate villain he's usually portrayed as. And finally, Doc Ock. Throughout the series, Otto plays more of a background villain, but when he shows up, he steals the show. He's got that classic comic book look and a great personality to match. One of my favourite moments is when he's casually dancing through his lab, effortlessly taking out cops left and right, laughing in their faces. But the second Iron Man shows up, the way he just instantly gives up is brilliant. Definitely one of the best sequences in the show. Overall, I think the show's on point with its characters, and with the way things are building up, it's going to be interesting to see where it all leads. This new Spider-Man series was definitely entertaining, but not without its flaws. Whilst the character dynamics and some of the villain portrayals were great, the convoluted plot twists, inconsistent animation, and the underwhelming portrayal of Spider-Man himself holds the series back from being truly great. My favourite animated Spider-Man so far is still the 2017 Marvel Spider-Man series. This 2025 series didn't manage to recapture the energy or charm that the 2017 one brought to the table, but I'll go into that more in a later video. Still, it's clear that there's potential here. If the series can smooth out its issues, it could become something amazing. For now though, it's a fun watch, but it's definitely not the best Spider-Man adaptation we've seen so far. But what did you think of this Spider-Man series, and what are your thoughts on the Osborn race swap? Let me know down in the comments below. And until next time peeps, stay frosty.